Good afternoon, and thank you for spending time with us. The next panel will be focused on the role of education policy. I'm Bob LePage from the Executive Office of Education in Massachusetts, and I am the Assistant Secretary for Career Education. And joining me on the panel today will be Maria Flynn, who I see in my little screen, President JFF. Jen James, the Undersecretary for Workforce Development and Labor, and Michael Britt-Crane, the Education Workforce Development Lead for DoD. And I'm going to ask each of them, starting with Michael, to just give a little bit of his role and a little introduction of himself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bob. So I'm Michael Britt-Crane. I'm the Education Workforce Development Lead in the Manufacturing Technology Office in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. In the EWD program at Mantech, my team and I oversee investments in manufacturing, education, and workforce development, including an SBIR program, the MassBridge project, and with our 9 DoD-sponsored manufacturing innovation institutes. We're also closely engaged with Department of Energy and Department of Commerce colleagues who sponsor the remaining institutes that make up the network of 16. And we've expanded that interagency collaboration. I'm now co-chairing with my colleague from the Department of Education, the EWD component of a National Science and Technology Council subcommittee on advanced manufacturing, where we're working across federal agencies to develop a strategic plan to address manufacturing, education, and workforce development across the federal government.
Thank you. And how about Maria?
Great. Hi, everybody. Maria Flynn. I'm the President and CEO of Jobs for the Future. We are a national nonprofit organization that works to drive economic advancement for all through the transformation of our nation's education and workforce systems. So we are headquartered in Boston. We also have offices in DC and Oakland that we do work around the country. So I like to think of us really sitting at the intersection of education and workforce and policy and practice, which is really where I have kind of spent my career. So before becoming part of the JFF team, I was with the U.S. Department of Labor for the first half of my career working in the Employment and Training Administration on issues like manufacturing workforce. So it's great to be here today.
And Jen James.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer James. I work in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. I work every day with Bob LePage, so this is an old home week on the panel. Our secretary oversees the in the conference day, and we partner with education and with economic development on some of the topics that we're covering at the conference today.
So we're going to now get started with some of the panel questions, and then we're going to work through. If you have questions, you can use the chat, and we'll try to address them time permitting at the end of the session. We're going to start with Michael. Why don't you talk about what you see as the current and emerging national landscape and your role for education policy and supporting DoD's manufacturing ecosystem?
It's a great question, Bob, and I'll probably focus a little on the landscape here. Really see a critical need in the policy domain to help our learning providers to push the envelope and modernize the education system. I'm going to focus here on the manufacturing because that's my bailiwick, where we have a national security, but also an economic prosperity imperative for a domestic manufacturing industry. And in order to have a robust industry there, we need to embrace and adopt these emerging advanced technologies like additive manufacturing, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, ubiquitous digital systems and sophisticated and particularly secure information systems. And these pervade across many industries, but they're absolutely critical to enhancing our productivity in manufacturing. And we just can't do this effectively without a skilled and capable workforce. This is something that we need, again, for national security, but also for economic prosperity and to be able to compete with our global competitors. So this really creates a need to both modernize our education system by embracing these new technologies, but in order to do that, really see a strong need to be much more flexible and agile and embrace and scale up some of the same new capabilities that these same technologies enable. Things like a flipped classroom, embracing digital education, especially when it comes to knowledge, but also retaining the skills advancement capability with practical hands-on exercises in laboratories. And I think very critically, we need a much greater connectivity between our education and training providers and our employers in industry, both to bring in those practical applications, but also to bring value to our students, to enable access to careers in this space in an equitable fashion. I really think that these technologies are commercializing, driven by industry, and in order to do that in a way that supports our domestic workforce, we need to have an educational capability that's keeping pace with that, and allowing equitable access to a broad array of students, not just the ones at the elite colleges and universities, but also for our skilled technical workforce and through our community colleges and technical and trade schools. In order to scale up these industries, we need 2 to 3 times or more skilled technicians as engineers and scientists and professionals with 4-year degrees. And that's a system where we are focused on really changing the way that that we do business in order to achieve much greater scale and velocity and keep pace with these emerging technologies. This is something that I feel a great degree of urgency for, because the fact remains, if we want to have these industries here in our country, we need to keep pace with our global competition. In manufacturing in particular, we've lost this, and these technologies offer a new opportunity to rebuild with a new technical base and a much higher skilled, high value manufacturing workforce. But it all hinges on the education capability.
Are there any particular promising practices or examples of states or regions or even individual institutions that you would like to note?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think the utilizing digital learning solutions and pushing the envelope on that technology to move beyond just knowledge and skills into the skills domain using virtual environments is one area, and there are a number of colleges and institutions that are doing this. One that I'll highlight here that's particularly out there, but particularly effective, and then I'll just touch on work-based learning because I think that's absolutely critical, and I know Maria is going to cover that very effectively. Is the use of virtual reality to VR headsets, you can create these virtual environments and use them for interactive learning on your laptop, but the Jumpstart Alabama project and Transfer VR is kind of the technology behind this. have really proven, and the proof is in the pudding because there's so much industry buy-in on this, that using virtual reality headsets and controllers can create a tool that both attracts students to these training programs, but it's also a flexible tool for the training itself. And it creates a space where the students are able to explore and develop some skills in a safe environment where they're free to fail without consequence and are thus take more risks and are able to learn more quickly in this safe environment. It's also highly scalable. So that's one in particular that I think is really driving us forward into this much more effective, efficient, and student-centric, and also much more equitable access through a transformed education system.
Excellent. And it sounds like Maria, he might have shared a little early thunder, but in your work at JFF, as you engage stakeholders across the country, what do you view as some additions or top 2 or 3 emerging opportunities related to new and innovative education policy?
Yeah, so there's 4 things I want to highlight, which I think dovetail really nicely with what Michael mentioned. And the first is really around equity, right? So I think we are in a really unique moment in our country where we have an opportunity to rebuild better, right? We have kind of a lot of arrows pointing in the right direction, so to speak, but how do we continue? And I like Michael's words around pushing the envelope and really looking to modernize. And how do we do that with really equity at the center? So I think, seeing that as a unique opportunity of this moment and how we can encourage employers, community colleges, training providers in general to really be thinking deeply around, how do we not just, rebuild what didn't work 20 years ago, but really use this moment and new resources and kind of new drivers of innovation to think about structure and delivery and access and opportunity in a new and different way. The second one is about scale. And so, first, and I saw a question, I think, from Roy Swift in the chat about, what are solutions beyond registered apprenticeship? And so I would say, absolutely, we should continue to scale and diversify registered apprenticeship. That's something that JFF is working very deeply on. But we also need to be looking at how to scale other high quality work-based learning opportunities, and whether that's for students who are still in school, in high school or in post-secondary education, whether that's for dislocated workers who are looking for new opportunities, but how can we continue to really highlight and design these high quality models? And totally agree with Michael that another, I think, emerging opportunity around scale is around immersive learning and looking at VR and AR as, again, another one of those kind of ways that technology and innovation can actually drive equity and access and opportunity. So really encourage folks to be thinking through, how can you incorporate AR, VR into your models? We're currently doing work both with SAP and Facebook in terms of piloting some of this work within corporations and like how they're approaching training as well. And I also, like in the MassBridge report, I really appreciated the language around curate versus create, because I think, those of us who have been doing this work for a while, right, we see a lot of reinventing the wheel, right? Because a employer or a community college may think, wow, we are so unique, we need to build our own program from scratch. And I think the good news about, the manufacturing sector is there's a lot of great nuggets out there. They just need to be curated and kind of moved forward in new ways. The third thing I would mention is just, again, in terms of a unique time, we have this very rich moment of policy debate, right, at the federal level and also at the state level. So how can we be thinking about, my concern with this moment is that we are talking about issues in silos. We talk about free college, but we talk about that separate from how we talk about investments in workforce development. And we think of that, separately from issues around kind of innovative finance strategies like income share agreements. So how can we use this moment to start to tie together some of these policy debates into one that is really looking at, again, like equity and opportunity for all. And then the third thing I would mention, I think there's an opportunity to be creative around embedding some of these models into the more traditional, degree models. So embedding kind of shorter term credentials or certifications into those degree programs, and looking at partnerships and alignment versus kind of, 100 flowers blooming, but looking how some of these points of impact can be tied together.
Excellent. And we had a kind of a complementary question to that I saw in the question and answer, and I think I said the chat earlier, and I was corrected, and it should be, please put them in your question and answer tool. How would hybrid education in practice align to those discussions as a strategy?
I think it's a really effective strategy, right? So how can we look at, almost like taking the best of both worlds, so to speak, right? So how can you combine kind of digital access and kind of anytime learning with, the more kind of hands-on in-person experience? And I think that's where, we can continue to really kind of push, as Michael said, push the envelope on innovation to see, what are new ways that we could be dreaming up to make this happen for more people.
I could just add on to that. I think the great thing about blended learning is that it can be deployed in a lot of different ways. But the key idea there is to, starting of course with knowledge, but I think verging into a little bit of skills and abilities with virtual environments and that sort of thing. Have this asynchronous student-centric learning experience, and then create leverage so that they're going into that hands-on practical piece already having some idea of what they're doing, and you're able to drive greater throughput through those lab activities, and also have better consistency and better kind of state-of-the-art content. You can invest a lot more in that digital learning content if you've got a larger audience for it. But then in that practical component, that can be much more tailored to localized capabilities and needs. And there's a lot of ways that can be deployed, either within a community college system across the state, or through a boot camp activity. Within, I think, Maria's point about integrating these innovative approaches into more traditional learning settings is absolutely critical, because that is the way to achieve scale. There's been a lot of innovation in the non-traditional learning space, and I think a lot of that can feed back into the bigger learning institutions that just have so many students running through them.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. I agree with you. I think it's how we deploy those tools strategically. And in the case, at least in Massachusetts, some of our early discussions about how you deploy the tools in an awareness stage to grab students' interest, and then how you build them through the credentialing, as Maria mentioned, of how you insert those opportunities into the process is important. Maria mentioned a couple of things, certainly, that are very aligned to the work that Jen James does, since, as she confessed, that we collaborate very often. Massachusetts has created a unique approach to support alignment and implementation of education, economic development, and workforce development policy. Can you explain how that is being driven and give some examples of efforts to implement new impactful policy?
Sure, Bob. That's funny, because we are, you and I are kind of the center of that initiative, but it really does resonate with all of the contributions we've heard from panelists today. It was pretty amazing to me. I started listening at the beginning of the conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our workforce skills cabinet pre-pandemic, but how it's helped us post-pandemic. And I will start off by saying, if you're not from Massachusetts, it is a decentralized, locally controlled world here. We have lots of localized governance structures, including the traditional Department of Labor system, which is what we call Mass Hire in Massachusetts. So we do a lot of partnering. The workforce world is messy. It's all over the place. It's everything and nothing all at the same time, as I tend to say, and you never do anything alone. It's always through partnership. And we've heard that over and over today. So to that end, when Governor Baker came into office, and in full disclosure, I've actually worked for the state in my role for 20 years. I've served 4 or 5 governors, and I can't count the number of secretaries. So I would say this is one of the first times we really, on purpose, formed a cabinet that was trying to stare the labor market in the face and think about the kinds of frameworks and policies that we needed to put in place. And it started off as like a nice thing to do, and it's really become the way that we work now as a Commonwealth. So it's been really great to be a part of this work. But we essentially got 3 of our state secretaries together on behalf of the governor: education, workforce, and economic development. And the simple but not so simple answer was, how do you align supply and demand in the labor market? And so that skills cabinet really became a communication forum across the secretariats to think about education policy, programs, investments. Again, it's everything and nothing all at the same time. And we started by kicking off a data initiative. And I actually am a proud graduate of the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning program about 20 years ago. And so we went back to like labor market 101, and we really looked at our state and regional data sets around job demand and worker supply. So lots of agencies sharing data against some of our known job openings. So we started just by getting people to agree around what the problem was we were trying to solve and where there were gaps. And again, we started this pre-pandemic. What that turned into was the formation of 7 regional planning teams. So Kathy from Mount Wachusett was on the last panel. It made me tear up. She was talking about how, the state came along and asked people to plan together as a team. And that was this workforce skills cabinet initiative around regional planning. But as she noted, better that she said it versus me, it really brought together the partners of the business leadership in a region, the lead economic development organizations, folks like in my world, the workforce boards, career centers, as well as our important post-secondary and K-12 partners. So it was they were big groups, even though we were regionalized, and we basically asked them to build a blueprint around the skill gap needs in their economy to start really thinking about what are the continuums and the pipelines that they have and where are their gaps. And that really helped the Commonwealth players, the fuller state cabinet, think about how to better invest our money and how to help support a lot of the regional hub concepts that that are featured in the MassBridge report. Massachusetts has healthcare collaborative hubs that are thinking about the manufacturing pipeline in their regions. We launched a similar initiative in healthcare, since that is the #1 skill gap need in our economy, was, and will be most likely going forward. And we have used the state team and the regional teams to really think about concentrating our resources to invest in pathways that are in the high demand jobs and occupations that we've identified. Again, building agreement around what those are, but to also think about some of the policy issues. So we've worked across education to build out new innovation pathways in the K-12 system. Again, thinking about how that connects to vocational technical education. Bob and his team have really led the rollout of that, but it's been backed by our economic development secretary, workforce, the governor. We invented a new program called the Career Technical Initiative, which builds out multiple layers of programming through our vocational technical schools, which are amazing. And we love our Voc Tech partners in Mass. But it really has traditional programming, and then in the evening begins to develop worker retraining for so many of the occupations that have been mentioned today. Really a key focus in trades and manufacturing, and they complement the manufacturing hub work at the same time. We've looked a lot with our post-secondary partners to think about what both Maria and many other folks this morning have talked about, but kind of blurring that line on the post-secondary level between workforce programs and for credit or degree seekers, really trying to integrate those things and blur the line or the division that some schools have. People don't care. They just want to achieve skill and move along. You know, they want what they did yesterday to count toward tomorrow's credential or certificate. So we put a lot of funding in and around that. And we try to fill gaps where Pell funding doesn't support credentialing, right? There really isn't an ecosystem for this because there isn't traditional funding streams. So we've tried to really align our state dollars and now our ARPA dollars to plug some of those funding holes. So the skills cabinet started as, hey, isn't it a good idea to think about what the plan is for building pipelines? And it's really become a way for us, even through COVID, to better mine our claimant data, understand who was hurt by COVID, think about where is there an oversupply of claimants, where we need to retrain people, and really has helped us communicate with the governor and the legislature around a robust plan to invest ARPA funding. So it sounds, I sound like a cheerleader, as I am. There are lots of bumps along the road, but I would credit the organizing concept of bringing the state and regional teams together is a huge part of what we've tried. I'm gonna stop there, Bob.
Okay, so thanks, Jen. So this is gonna come out to all the members, and we have, I wanna leave a little bit of time for questions in case we get any. There's a couple at the bottom there. So to all the members, and I'll do Michael first. If you could share an example of the key, what you think the key to developing and implementing successful, and I'm going to add the word strategic education policies, because I know we all believe strategic education policies are the key. What would it be? What would you say is the top one or two? I'll give you two, but it's always hard to pick one.
Okay. So I'm really going to endorse the skills cabinet here and maybe extend that idea a little bit farther. I think what's really key today in workforce, and maybe this has always been true, but it's definitely true today, is to really lean on that partnership model. In order to build effective workforce education and training systems, you need this diverse array of stakeholders. And now, again, in advanced manufacturing education, we need to bring industry in, not just to help determine credential requirements that are going to have value, and do so in a modular fashion, so they're flexible and adaptable to the evolving technology, but also and of course to drive the labor market need and all of the labor market 101 that Jen outlined, that I think is absolutely critical to be done on a regional basis, but with the support of the state and federal governments. And that's very much the strategy that we're working to pursue, develop these, curate, identify these cutting edge approaches, and then work to scale those up and make them available to our partners in state and local government so that they can apply them in their region, understanding the needs of their set of stakeholders and all the assets they're working with. And it's all built on these partnerships. And I think I started to say this before and didn't quite get to it, that the technology driver here in manufacturing, but across other industries as well, really necessitates the need to bring in those academic and industry partners who understand where the technology is today and what the skills needs are, so that our education and training is leading to students and workforce coming out who have relevant skills for today and for tomorrow. And that really necessitates this broad system change, but it's really all built on partnerships and that kind of aligned collaboration.
And Maria, certainly you have lots of these experience, but can you pick out one that you would, again, give as the key, the secret sauce to developing and implementing strategic education policies?
Yeah, so I will build from Michael's like call for partnership, because I completely agree with that. And I will build on it by, I think, one, the importance of going beyond kind of the existential debate, right? Because I think a lot of times in workforce, particularly like in policy discussions, right, the conversation is like up here, right? I was in a meeting with Secretary Walsh last week, and I felt a lot of the folks who were, giving him feedback, it was so like broad and theoretical, and I feel like that's not really helpful, right? When you're trying to make and drive policy. And so how can you kind of get not like in the weeds, but to those tangible ideas that can really drive income, output and impact and transformation. So I think like getting to that right grain size of the argument is really key. And then also similar to Michael's point, like the importance of data in that. And I would say like on all sides, right? To policymakers, to folks doing the work on the ground. And I'll just use an example I heard recently, right, of how a lot of times folks who are making decisions like in local workforce boards just don't really have the information that they need to make good decisions. And so in this case, it was a startup that is training individuals to repair electric vehicle charging stations, right? So a type of job that's, in high growing demand in a lot of areas. But so many of the workforce boards that they're going to like just don't have, it's not on their radar. It's probably not showing up yet, maybe even in like the burning glass data, right? So how can you really be using data more effectively to drive not only like near-term immediate decisions, but those longer-term like policy decisions as well?
And now over to you, Jen.
Yeah, the science, that art form of short-term, long-term data analysis, I mean, is definitely, well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say everything they said. And I would just, the new concepts that I would add to the dialogue that I see around successful education policy in Mass. We all have a fairly decent handle on how to build curriculum and how to build quote unquote programming. I think the change going forward, especially coming off the pandemic, should have been true before, is you need those partnerships, you need that data, you need really strong programming curriculum, but you also need wraparound support and services and partnerships that are more than just the education for people to really succeed. And I think that's a whole new level of partnership that brings in our friends from Health and Human Services, and it gets messier and messier, right? As you start to really think about that holistic approach. But people are doing it, and I know I've seen it in Massachusetts, and I know that's happening across the country. But I think that's one way forward on success. Wraparound is a key critical criteria. And I also just think this concept of hands-on learning, hybrid learning, whatever label you want to put on it, is one of the best delivery models for acquiring skill and shifting toward a higher percent of programs that either K-12 or post-secondary really deliver hybrid models with employer partners is to me the future and where we need to go in terms of criteria and where we're trying to drive things here, certainly in Massachusetts. So
I'm going to take an exception. I'm going to give 2 words, and then I'm going to pull out a question from Michael from the question bar. And I'm going to say what my experience has been over many years is really quite simple. It's invite because it's amazing what people do, but they don't get together to share what they're doing and how they could collaborate. And once you invite them, sometimes the best thing to do is to then just try to make progress. And I know Jen gets tired of saying progress, is try to make progress and celebrate that progress, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling wheel of everybody trying to get things moving. So just keep inviting more people who are really smart to talk to each other. They'll make progress. And the more they make progress, then the less work you have to do, because they're doing all the work. So that's my strategy. Worked well for more than 20 years, Jen, many more than 20. We have a question and a couple questions. I'm going to feed them to the individuals. Michael, this is for you. I can see that students get attached to these virtual reality immersive learning, but can a quote, real world experience be simulated through these models? And can they take place of, say, an internship? So I'm going to feed that first to Michael, and then why don't we get comments from the others?
Sure. Great question. And I really see this as a continuum that today, I think the simple answer is no. I think as we continue to build out virtual environments and leverage technologies that were developed for other industries like gaming to create richer and richer simulations, that we can push from knowledge being delivered in a digital self-directed form to starting to get into some skills and some practice, but maybe not validation of those skills and performance assessment, and certainly not all of the troubleshooting and real world things that you run into. Those go into that kind of practical experience, which I think there's also a continuum there. And that's where the employer engagement is really a critical piece, where there's a continuum from laboratory exercises where you get your hands on the stuff and maybe start to verge into that with the virtual environments, and then capstone projects. But then the ultimate is that real application, value add project work that really primarily needs to be driven by industry partners. And the closer and closer you get to that, the more and more value that student's going to be able to bring on day one when they enter a job. And it's, I think, our job to work to build these systems that advance our students through that continuum as much as we can, as fast as we can. So the great thing about the digital solutions is their scalability and flexibility and some of the student-centric attributes of being able to do these things on your own with nobody watching you, so you're free to fail rapidly and advance rapidly. But that value of the hands-on practical component and the teamwork experience, it can't be reproduced in the digital environment now. But I think the state of the art of that virtual environment is progressively moving closer and closer. And that gives us more and more leverage with that highly scalable product to drive greater throughput and have students that are bringing more value more quickly in the labor marketplace.
Maria, any observations from your travels around the country on simulation in any sector, whether it's manufacturing or other sectors, and how you think that VR and other tools can be leveraged?
Yeah, I agree with Michael. I think it's not a replacement, right, for the actual on the job, but I do agree with him that it's an acceleration strategy, right? So I think it can get folks kind of to that starting line faster, so to speak. And I saw in the chat there, like a challenge to the idea that this is it can be like an equity strategy. But I do think that it can be, and I think that is something that we need to be working towards, right? So how can you, and I think this is a role for that the federal government can help to play, is how you can start making some of these technology-based tools more accessible to more students and workers. So I think we have work to do, but I think it's the right direction.
I'd like to just add on to that equity question, because this comes up a lot, and there are challenges because we don't have universal access to digital digital tools and systems and high bandwidth internet connections. So there is an equity challenge there. That's a challenge that's not just facing the education system, it's a challenge for the nation. But the scarcest resource of all that we have are the access to expensive industrial equipment in laboratory and industrial environments, and the expert instructors who need to be there for that resource. So yes, a VR headset is expensive. Yes, a laptop and a high bandwidth internet connection is not available to everybody. But those things are have much greater availability and scalability and lower cost than does a learning laboratory in an industrial environment. And if those things can help bring students in and create access and visibility, just awareness, and then enable that learning pathway and lead them to have that the students have those skills and that value to industry, then that can be used to help promote equity, but not without challenges.
Jen, anything to add on simulation? And I got a couple observations I'll add, and then we'll jump to the next question.
No, Michael and Maria covered it well. It strikes me as such a great topic to get industry buy-in, right? Either they think it's of value to practice skills in a virtual environment or not. It's just a great way to get industry to talk to you and kind of talk through the curriculum. But everything they laid out was, I think, kind of hopeful, actually, thinking about where this will all go.
Yeah, and I'll just add it. I fully support those comments, and I think they're dead on, but just give you an example of how we've tried to think about that in Massachusetts, both from an equity perspective and an access perspective, whether that's geographic access or community access. Through the work of the Skills Cabinet, we've invested what will soon be $100 million over the last 5-ish years in technology and equipment, and probably 30% of that has been into industrial grade manufacturing equipment. And as we've made all those investments in CNC machines and all the traditional industrial machines, and we've invested in, like everybody else, scads and scads of 3D printers. One of the opportunities and strategies we've tried to deploy, as Jen mentioned, are what are called innovation pathways. And it's in those innovation pathways where I believe virtual reality equipment will sit. In a traditional high school where you don't have access for that student to get in front of significant equipment that might be available at a community college, or in our case, some of our vocational schools that are career tech education, similar to other states' technical colleges, or in our universities. But through VR, you can spark the interest of the student and provide some level of skill sets that will allow them to advance. And I also think that long term, there's a really good parallel to the way we think about healthcare simulation, where 20 years ago or 10 years ago, even when we talked about healthcare simulation and patient simulations, I used to always hear, well, those are really good, but they're never going to replace or impact clinicals. But what I can tell you right now is that we certainly learned in the last few years that the ability to use simulation to offset some portion of a clinical experience have proven to be very effective, scalable tools. And I think in the manufacturing realm, as we think about that again, progression, volume of students, access of students, that there is a sweet spot where it may not replace fully the hands-on experience of students. It can better prepare them to run that equipment, to then be prepared for an internship or clinical. So I do think that there is really an emerging spectrum of that student engagement and experience that VR is going to play, not just in manufacturing, but it doesn't matter if it's bioscience or whatever the element might be, that there's a real opportunity. I'm going to jump to one more, and then we're going to turn it to the next panel. Oh, I got a number of them. Concerning the technology and education, isn't the organically authentic more important than repetitive technical matrix? Wow, I'm gonna start with that because Michael's smiling. I'm going to give that to Michael, and then I'm going to hope it runs out of time because I'm not sure how I.
Sounds like a great question for Michael.
Thanks, guys. I guess I'll take it. So I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I think that this is actually an argument for this more student-centric but highly scalable educational model where through digital means and others, students have access to self-paced learning that gives them access to potentially multiple modalities for a given concept and allows them to move at their own pace and move along the scaffolding without moving on until they've actually understood that concept to the next piece, and to take I think some of the challenges that we've probably all experienced in our education years ago, of just getting through those problem sets and all of the repetitive aspects of learning some of this knowledge and some of these skills, and puts it in a student-centric frame that allows them to progress in a much more modular and micro fashion that's more tailored to the student. And again, that exists in varying degrees today. And there's a lot of build out, innovation, and development that needs to occur to sort of fully realize that dream. But I really see a lot of progress towards that happening today, and freeing up the instructor time to be more of a coach and a guide, and focus on the practical application, the hands-on component, the human skills of interacting with a team, working with a customer, working with an industry representative, or across institutions. So I'm not sure if I captured the essence of the question, but that's how I interpreted it.
Well, with that, we've run out of time. I want to thank my panel members for their awesome job today, and thanks Steve and the team, the MI team in particular, for organizing. We're going to turn it over to my colleague Farhad, who's going to coordinate the next panel. So I think those panel members are going to switch on, and this panel is going to switch on.